Bring in our reporter, Joe St. George, who has been covering this case from the very beginning, knows all the players, all the actors in it. Joe, describe what you saw today at the hearing.
Clearly the most poignant part, the most emotional part was when Maureen McDonnel addressed the court bill for the first time. Since this entire ordeal began, we heard from Mrs. McDonnell, the former First Lady, in her own words. I'm just going to read a couple very poignant quotes she said. She told Judge James Spencer, "I am the one who allowed the serpent into the mansion, and the venom of that snake has poisoned my marriage, my family, and the Commonwealth that I love." She took responsibility. It was a moment in the courtroom in which she had to pause for tears. She was crying. In fact, the government, the prosecution, even offered tissues at one point. But it was the first time, Bill, that we heard from the former First Lady in her own words.
Well, and did she address in any way some of the characterizations that she may have suffered from during, for example, the trial of the former governor, when we heard these infamous words about thrown under the bus, that some called her a nutbag, a diva? Did she address any of that and how that might have impacted her?
She did not address some of the name calling that perhaps we heard throughout the coverage of this trial. Lady Macbeth with an Amex card was one that was mentioned in defense paperwork. There is another quote that I think we've heard so much in this case from reporters and from journalists and from Governor Bob McDonnell. We haven't heard what Mrs. McDonnell has been thinking, and now we at least have some quotes we can attribute to her. Quote, she said to the judge, "My marriage is broken, my family is hurting, my reputation is in shatters." Again, she tried to convince Judge James Spencer to give her probation, to give her 4,000 hours of community service, and did so during a speech, but ultimately the judge looked her in the eye, looked members of her family in the eye, and said, "This is a puzzling woman." He called this case tragic, sad, and puzzling, and said, "Even I, at this point in time, don't know who the real Mrs. McDonnell is."
And what was the reaction to her friends and family? Because we heard from her middle daughter, Rachel, we heard from her niece, we heard from her best friend, Mary Guy. How did they react in the sentence?
There were tears in the courtroom, but it certainly was not the level of shock or a level of relief that we saw during Governor Bob McDonnell's sentencing last month. There was a noticeable moment of relief during Governor Bob McDonnell's sentencing. Not necessarily the case here, because as we mentioned, as Dr. Bob mentioned, there was speculation that she could get away with just probation, or maybe just a couple months in prison. But 12 months and 1 day, a substantial sentence, and I know you alluded to it earlier, that's a significant number, because 12 months and 1 day allows her to get credit for good time, and I know that our legal analyst Todd Stone will speak about that, the legalese of that, but certainly a remarkable day in court. One thing we should mention, not all of her family members were there. That shows you the extent of the turmoil that this family has gone through. Her son Sean wasn't there, her daughter Janine wasn't there, and there is some speculation that Janine and her mother have had a rough patch throughout this, as you can imagine, ordeal.
And we heard briefly from the former governor on his way in. He did not speak at the hearing today. What impact, if any, do you think that had, his presence there today?
Well, I saw the two conversing, talking, even smiling before the sentencing got underway. That's the most visible emotion, most visible interaction I've seen between the two, certainly during the 6 weeks of the trial, certainly during the sentencing last month. He sat next to his son Bobby, often had his hand around his shoulder, and it will be interesting to see what he says after this. The judge did say that he will allow bond pending appeal, since the Fourth Circuit.
So he took care of that.
He took care of that ahead of time. So bond pending appeal. That means Mrs. McDonnell won't be going to jail right now. She won't be taken off in handcuffs. This isn't over, as they say. There's going to be a very important appeals hearing a little bit later in the spring down the court. And here comes the prosecutors. David, anything you say, Michael? It's already anything you want to say, Michael? Lead prosecutor. That's lead prosecutor Michael Dry walking through the case. It will be interesting to see if the U.S. Attorney Dana Buente says anything. Again, we have a second camera set up at a podium to hear from the U.S. Attorney in this case, Bill.
All right, we are going to hear hopefully from some of those in just a moment. I want to take this time now, if we could.